Hey, look, we have been in a series for the past few weeks called He Said What? And we've been in this series, we've been looking at these difficult and difficult sayings of Jesus. They're challenging. We read them, and oftentimes we step back and we're like, did Jesus, did he really say that? Man, that is wild that Jesus said that. And we look at it, and we're trying to figure out how do we apply these things to our lives. We looked at a ton of different ones. Does anybody remember what week 1 was? That was Mr. Hotz did that one. Anybody remember that one? Just yell it out to me. Hate your mother was the first week. That's the next one. Hate your mother was first week. Alex taught us about how Jesus challenged his disciples and even us to really count the cost, to consider what are the most important things and what kind of things we might need to give up. I feel like my mic is really loud right now, so I don't know if you can back me down just a little bit, John. Thank you. All right. So that is the things that we've been looking at for week 1. Week 2 was which one? Right here? You said it a while ago. Week 2? You said, I am the way, right? Jesus is the way. He is the way, and he is the way. He is the only way. And it's not a popular thing to say in our world today, but that is what Jesus taught, and that's what the Bible, I think, shows as well, that there was no other way. Week 3, do you remember that one? Yeah, take up your cross. We talked about how Jesus challenges his followers to deny themselves. How often? Daily, and then to take up their cross, to be willing to be humiliated and ridiculed for Jesus' sake. And in Jesus' particular case, it meant death on a cross. But for us, I think it could mean something slightly different as far as humiliation and ridicule. All right, week 4, that was last week. That was the tough one. You guys remember that one? Brandon, yeah, I'm so glad Brandon is sticking with you guys. All right, love your enemies. All right, it's a tough one. Did anybody go out and live this out this week? Right? Also said that Spectrum Internet is his enemy. You maybe a little bit. I'll be honest. So today is Wednesday. So Thursday of last week, I had a really hard time playing basketball with Brandon. It was pretty difficult. I'm not gonna lie to you. But I played basketball with Brandon yesterday, and it was pretty good. He was on my team. We had a couple high fives and a couple good job buddies. So I just got choked. We're making progress. We're making progress on our relationship, and I haven't invited him over for dinner. I haven't bought him a gift card, and I haven't bought him a new pair of shoes. But we're in the works. All right, we're making progress. So those are what we've talked about up to this point. We got 2 weeks left in our series, and tonight we look at number 5, next to the end. And to start this off, I want to share with you guys something called Aesop's Fable. It's one of Aesop's Fables. Have you guys ever heard one of these? Cool. All right, let me read this one for you guys. A hare was making fun of the tortoise one day for being so slow. A hare is a rabbit, by the way, and a tortoise is a turtle. Do you ever get anywhere? He asked with a mocking laugh. Yes, replied the tortoise, and I get there sooner than you think. I will run you a race and prove it. The hare was much amused at the idea of running a race with the tortoise, but for the fun of the thing, he agreed. So the fox... That's just a fox. That's like a regular name. Who had consented to act as a judge, marked the distance and started the runners off. The hare was soon far out of sight, and to make the tortoise feel very deeply how ridiculous it was for him to try a race with a hare, he lay down beside the course to take a nap until the tortoise should catch up. The tortoise, meanwhile, kept going slowly but steadily, and after a time passed the place where the hare was sleeping. But the hare slept on very peacefully, and when at last he did wake up, the tortoise was near the goal. The hare now ran his swiftest, but he could not overtake the tortoise in time. Have you guys ever heard this story before? This story, maybe you've heard it, and Jesus is going to tell us a similar story tonight. And so this is the phrase that we're going to look at. The first will be last. All right? The first will be last. That is the phrase that we are looking at tonight. That was a line that Jesus was known for saying. He had said it multiple times, and in the Gospels, we see it recorded in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. At different points and different parts of Jesus' ministry, he uses this phrase, and we see this phrase is reused again in folktale literature and all of this, that the last will be first. I love using this one when I'm losing a basketball game. Hey man, the last are going to be first, or if someone else is winning, I'm going to say, hey, the first is going to be last. We use this phrase. And we're going to look at a story that Jesus told. So Aesop told us Aesop's fable. He told a story about how this applies. And Jesus is going to use a story to kind of get his point across tonight as well. And so we're going to look at this story together. 2 stories in a row. You should like that, right? All right, so Jesus tells this story about a guy who owned a vineyard. You guys know what a vineyard is? Somebody tell me what a vineyard is. Yeah, they grow grapes and like in Jesus' day it might have been figs or other things. But yeah, it's a place where they grew some sort of produce. It's a guy who owned a vineyard and it was time for harvest or time for work. Something needed to be done around the vineyard. And so the guy goes to the marketplace. Now, this isn't Facebook Marketplace. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but that's totally different. But marketplace, it was very common in that day that people would kind of stand around and they would look to be hired. They would say, hey, I need a job. I want to work today. And so they would kind of gather around this place and got people who owned businesses or needed workers. They would kind of come around and say, hey, I need 4 guys to come help me on my vineyard today. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? By the way, if I owned a vineyard, would anybody come help me? All right, cool, because I got some yard work I need to do. I'm gonna bring you guys over, all right? Free. I'll pay you no attention. All right, so he hires some guys in the morning. The owner of the vineyard, he goes and he hires a few guys. And he says, hey, I will pay you a denarius. It's about a day's wage in that time, a decent wage. I'll pay you a denarius if you can come work on my vineyard today. So he brings those guys over. They begin to work on his vineyard. He realizes, hey, you know what? I'm going to need some more help. So a few hours later, he goes back to the marketplace. He's like, hey, I need a few guys to work today. Picks a few guys, takes them back to his vineyard. He realizes, man, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of stuff we got to do. And he goes back to the marketplace, gets a few more guys, brings them back to his vineyard. The day is getting pretty close to being done, but he's like, you know what? There's still some more work that we got to finish out before the day's up. So he went back to the marketplace and he picked up a few guys. Said, hey, I need just a few guys. I can tell that like nobody has picked you guys up. Nobody's got you guys working today. You guys want to come work for me. Brings them back to his vineyard and they work. And then at the end of the day, when the day is done, the sun is going down. That's sort of how day's wage would work in that time, sun up to sundown kind of thing. So the sun's going down. He decides that he's going to go pay everybody for their work. And so what he does is, now the people who he hired very early in the morning, they had agreed to a wage. They had agreed to 1 denarius, what would be common for a day's wage in that time. But what we see is that the owner of the vineyard, instead of paying them first, he paid the person who he had hired last, so the person who only worked for that little bit of time at the end of the day. And he comes up and he gives the guys there a denarius, all right? And then the next set of guys that he had hired, maybe around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he gives them also each a denarius. And then the guys he hired at lunchtime, a denarius. A guy he hired just after breakfast, a denarius. And then the guys who agreed to work for a denarius in the very morning, he also gave them a denarius. So everybody earned the same amount of money in the day, whether you worked the entire day or for a little bit. And guess who was mad about that? Yeah, the people who had worked all day, right? They were upset that everyone made the same wage, so they were grumbling. So that is the story that we see. And so we see that Jesus is showing no matter how long anyone worked in the vineyard, they're going to make the same wage. And as we put that into spiritual terms and the meaning that Jesus is trying to get across, because think about Aesop's fable. He's obviously not talking about a turtle and a rabbit, right? He's trying to apply that into a modern day life. And so Jesus is doing the same thing. He's trying to get to his disciples, telling them what's going on. And so when we put that into spiritual terms, into heavenly terms, we see that Jesus is comparing his disciples who had been with him all along, who had given up a lot for Jesus. They'd been following him since the very beginning, and comparing them to other people who had just began to follow him. And Jesus saying, whether you followed me from the beginning or whether you just started right before the sun went down, your reward is going to be the same. You still get the same reward. And so that is what the people in the vineyard were upset about, and we're going to see that the disciples were pretty upset about that as well. And so this saying is aimed at a very specific group of people. I think like those 12 disciples who had been following Jesus from the very beginning. We see every time that this phrase, the first will be last, is mentioned, we often see that the disciples are asking for something. Especially in the Mark 10 account, we see that the disciples are kind of bartering with Jesus as well, who is going to get to sit on your right hand, on your right side in heaven? And Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to serve, or to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He's saying, you know what? None of you are going to get a seat of honor in heaven, because we're all going to get there, and you should just be glad that you're there. We're all going to be on equal standing. Your reward is heaven. Your reward is not where you get to sit in heaven. The fact that you're in heaven and eternal life with God, that is the reward. And so he's aimed at the disciples because they've obviously given up the most for Jesus. They've dedicated their whole lives. They've put everything to the side, all for following Jesus. And I think they're kind of have you guys ever heard of this statement of a humble brag? Humble brag. It would be kind of like a celebrity, like taking a selfie. I get my phone out for visual effect. Like taking a selfie because they're like serving at an orphanage in South America. You're like, check it out, guys. I'm serving at an orphanage. Like this idea that man, I'm giving up so much to do something really nice. But in reality, they kind of just wanted something nice for their social media. Or think about it let's say that it was a kid is in the hospital and they're dying, and their dying wish is to meet a celebrity, and the celebrity as they're on their way to the hospital, they're oh man, I got to go to the hospital because this is kid's dying wish to meet me. I mean, being a celebrity is such a drag, Do you get that feeling? It's just humble brag where you're I've given up so much, and it's just it's so hard to do that sometimes, just give up everything. And the disciples had given up a lot. And they're using this idea well, since I've given up so much, as I've done so much, and I've worked for such a long day, shouldn't my reward be better because of that? And Jesus is saying, no. The people who've worked the longest are going to be last. And in this particular story, in Matthew 10, we see that it's not really a first and last thing. It's really everyone gets the same wage. Everyone gets the same reward. And so that is really the essence of Jesus' saying. That's the story that we get. And I think that there are several ways that we can respond to that. There's several things that we can do outwardly or inwardly or whatever in response to hearing that. Because it means that for those of you in this room who have said, I want to follow Jesus and I'm a Christian and I want to try to obey God and do what is right, for those of you in the room that said that, it means that you are giving up things in your life for following Jesus. And you might look at other people who aren't Christians and they get to do whatever they want to do. They get to maybe do these things that you say, I want to do that, but I can't because I follow Jesus. Maybe cheating on a test or however that looks like. You might see that and you say, you know what, I can't do that. I'm limiting myself, or I'm being obedient to God. Or maybe there are things that you do have to do in life because you're a Christian. And so you're giving up those things, and you can look at other people who might wait until the very end of their life to follow Jesus, might be on their deathbed following Jesus. And you can say, I've spent my entire life, maybe up to this point, or you can look towards the future. I spent my entire life following Jesus, and they're going to spend just a moment. And you mean that even though I've given up all of this stuff, that we're going to have the same thing in the end, that we're going to get the same reward? And the truth is, yeah, you're going to get the same reward in the end, and that is eternity with God. And so you hear that, and you're like, well, why don't I just wait? And so let's get to some of these responses real quick before I get too far ahead of myself. So when we hear this, the first will be last. No matter how long you're working in the Lord's vineyard, your reward will be the same. Your first response is that you could delay. You could delay because we know our reward is the same. Look at verses 6 and 7 of the Matthew account. He says, and about the 11th hour, I mean, we're almost to the end of the workday, he went out and found others standing, and he said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And so we see this idea that to follow Jesus now is inconvenient. It's difficult. It's hard. And so you say, well, if it's hard for me to do that right now, and I mean, Alan's basically up here telling me it doesn't matter if I get saved now and follow Jesus now, or if I wait until the end of my life, then why not just wait till the end of my life? So the thing is that we don't know how many times our master is going to go back to the marketplace and look for people to work in his vineyard. We don't know that the opportunity will always be there. And so one response when we see this is that, well, I'm going to delay. I'm going to wait to follow Jesus because I don't want to have to be obedient to what God has called me to do. I don't want to have to tell other people about Jesus. I don't want to have to do all of these things that God has called me to do. And so we delay. And I would encourage you to not use that response, to not do that, because we don't know that we will ever get another opportunity to work in the Lord's vineyard. Another way that we could respond to this is with envy. It says we could show envy toward others. Because look at verse 11, it says, and on receiving it, talking about their day's wage, they grumbled at the master of the house. They were mad. They were envious both at the master and also at the other workers. They were like, that dude only helped me for 30 minutes. How does he make the same amount of money that I did? And I've worked all day. Come on, that's not fair. That's not right. And we can be envious towards the other person who is coming later on in life to follow Jesus. Just think about someone right now who you know is not a Christian, who you know does not love God, does not obey. Maybe they're like the exact opposite of what we would think a Christian is. And so maybe you know them and you grow up with them, and at some point in life they say, I want to be a Christian. I'm going to put my faith in Jesus. And you get mad because you're like, man, don't you just remember how bad they treated me, all the bad stuff that they did, everything that they did wrong, and now they're like, yeah, I'm going to follow Jesus, and they just think everything's better, everything's going to be all right. And we can be envious towards someone else who becomes a Christian later on in life, and they're bringing all that baggage along with them. And the reality is, it puts us into number 3, response number 3, in that we could, I believe it's number 3, throw it up there. We could, begrudge God's generosity. We could be mad at God, or in our story's case, the workers can be mad at the master for the sake that he's willing, that he's generous to the other people in giving them a day's wage. And we could be mad at God for forgiving other people for all the bad things that they did. I'm sure you can think of someone who's done something worse than maybe the things that you've done. Maybe if you think about someone who's like a murderer, someone who's like abused somebody, and to think that, man, God is going to forgive them. I mean, come on, forgive them. Look at what they did. Look at all the bad things that they did. And we can begrudge God's generosity for forgiving someone because we don't think that that's fair, that they ought to be forgiven, that they don't deserve that. I was actually reading through a commentary, and it says that the real focus of this passage is not that the person is upset that their wage wasn't enough, is that the reality is that the focus is on how generous the master was to the other people. Because the person who was hired in the morning, they agreed to work for a day's wage. They agreed to the denarius. They're not mad or upset that they only received 1 denarius. They're upset that the master was so generous to the other people because they felt like those people did not deserve it. Our response number 4 could be that we despair. That you're just like, Alan, this is stupid. This is dumb. Why would I work for the entire day, for my whole life, if I could just work for a moment and I'm going to make the day's wage? I'm going to make the same thing whether I work all day or for a portion. I used to work in a Target warehouse, and we had this phrase. This is not in my notes. I'm going a little off here. We used to do this thing where we would say, work smarter, not harder. Yeah, okay, I'm glad I'm not the only one that remember that. Work smarter, not harder. And it's like, if I could work for this much, or I could work for this much, and I get the same thing at the end, well, why wouldn't I? And I want you to know this is the reality. And this response number 5 is the response that I hope all of us take. And that is that we rejoice. We rejoice in the simple fact that we even get to work in the Lord's vineyard. That we're not unemployed, that we are in the marketplace and the Lord called us to work in his vineyard, that he called us to be a Christian, that we are able to do that in the first place. Whether we get to work for God our entire life by evangelizing and telling other people about him and following him and being obedient to him, whether we get to that for our whole life or just for a moment, we ought to rejoice in the simple fact that we get to. Because the reality is none of us deserve to work in the Lord's vineyard. None of us deserve it. And so when we begrudge God's generosity for saving someone and restoring a relationship with someone who we don't think deserves it, we are in that same boat. We don't deserve it either. None of us have done enough good or enough perfect things or had a perfect track record good enough to have a relationship with God. It is only through what Jesus has done on our behalf, in our stead, that we even get it. And so we ought to be just pretty freaking happy that we even get to work in the Lord's vineyard because we don't deserve it. And so I hope that whether we becoming a Christian or we see someone who is really far from God, really messed up, done some really bad stuff, and they become a Christian too, that we clap, that we rejoice, that we are happy that the Lord did that, not that we begrudge and say, well, man, they don't deserve it. Because the reality is none of us deserve what God has given us in the first place. And so I hope that when somebody who's treated us wrong and done us wrong and treated us badly, maybe done something really bad to you, and that whenever they profess faith and they say, no, I trust Jesus now, I want to be obedient to God, I want to live a life for him, that we aren't mad about it, that we aren't upset, that we are happy, that we are rejoicing in that we are grateful that they get to join us in our work, that we get to work alongside them in God's vineyard at a same goal. And so I think that many of us in this room have already placed our faith in Jesus. We've already committed to that lifestyle, that we're going to follow Jesus, that we're going to be obedient to him. And I think when we hear this passage, we can do all of those responses. We could despair. We could be envious, begrudging God's generosity. We could say all of those things. We could say that. But I hope that we wouldn't. I hope rejoicing is the reality that we find ourselves in, that we are happy that we get to work for God, that we get to tell others about him, and that other people can join us in that mission. If you're in this room and you're like, I don't really know what Alan's talking about with this whole like committing my life to following God, and so maybe you're in that category and you're looking at this and you're saying, you know what, I could like delay. Like I don't have to follow Jesus right now because I got like a lot of things I want to do. I got kind of my own plan, my own thing that I want to do. And if I can just wait until like I'm about 5 years from dying, I'm like 80 years old, I could just wait until then and I can be like, yeah, I love you, God. Yeah, please take me to heaven. And you'll be okay. I want to encourage you, don't delay. To join in that work, to join in that mission of working in the Lord's vineyard and telling other people about him and joining the rest of us on that mission. So maybe you are a worker, you're waiting to get hired. I want to encourage you to not delay, to jump in. We will rejoice with you. We will be happy for you. And so I would encourage you to do that tonight. In fact, if you are in that spot and you're like, I don't know what a relationship with God is, I've never committed to that, and you're interested, I want you to come grab me and talk to me at some point tonight and let me know that that's something you're interested in. I would love to walk you through what that looks like, and yeah, just to have that conversation with you to try and point you in the right direction. But listen, what we want to do right now is we want to break out into some small groups and discuss some of these things together. So there's going to be 3 questions that are going to pop up on the screen. And I want you to work through these 3 questions together, all right? So go ahead, break out into groups, about 6 people each. So 6 people in a group, and our adults will kind of split up and pop in those groups as well. So let's go ahead and break up into little circles of about 6 people. Kind of be looking. And if our leaders can kind of split up, find a group. All right, make sure you're circling up with a leader and working through these 3 questions together. All right, well, I hope you've had enough time to work through those questions together. I was overhearing some of those conversations. I think those are pretty sweet, pretty amazing. So look, remember that no matter how long we are serving Christ and following him, our reward is the same. And when other people join us along in that mission, we should rejoice with them, we should celebrate with them, and we should work to keep bringing more people along with us to follow Christ. So I hope you'll remember that this week, be able to apply some of those things in your life.